Okay, so Eagles training camp is about to have some fierce competition. But which positions are the most important to keep an eye on and what spots are up for grabs? Plus, what area of Jalen Hurts' game does Kellen Moore need to incorporate to maximize his potential? And why does Jeffrey Lurie believe Nick Sirianni is the next Andy Reid or Bill Belichick? Meanwhile, with Sidney Brown landing on the PUP list, could Philly sign another safety sooner rather than later? Let's talk about it. But first, let's run it. What's up, guys? So let's just say, thank goodness training camp is just about here, as the players are getting back into Philly with all parties officially reporting Tuesday and then practices starting Wednesday. But speaking of parties, Landon Dickerson hosted a pre-Eagles camp slip and slide party for some of the birds. Because, why not just have a little bit of fun before the real work starts? By the way, for those wondering, the Eagles camp schedule this week is a practice at 10 a.m. Wednesday, practice at 10 a.m. Thursday, a walkthrough Friday, and then another practice at 10 a.m. Saturday. Of course, as you all know, we'll have recaps and breakdowns and everything from every single day of practice, so, make sure to subscribe, turn the notifications on so you don't miss a thing. Also, kudos to Nick Sirianni for changing his tune and adding more practices, admitting that's something that perhaps the squad needs more of. And who knows, maybe that was thanks to a little advice or ask from Vic Fangio.
Well, you got to make do with what you got, but I keep pushing for more.
Did you push for more this offseason before coming here?
I'll let Nick answer that for you.
I get keeping the players fresh and limiting injuries, but at the same time, there's new schemes to learn, new systems, everything else, plus week 1 in Brazil. Let's make sure we're firing on all cylinders. Which also, another side note, but according to multiple reporters, Packers quarterback Jordan Love won't be practicing until he gets a new deal. However, the Pats GM said he's optimistic that they'll get a new deal done in a few days, so don't go thinking he'll miss any significant time with the team. Regardless, though, and either way, it's going to be important to start off on a strong note. With NBC Sports' Tom Curran saying if the Eagles struggle out of the gate, it wouldn't be surprising to see Philly pull the plug early on Sirianni. And then furthering that along to say the Eagles are favorites to land Bill Belichick if there were an early vacancy. Although according to the Inquirer, Birds owner Jeffrey Lurie believes he's already got the next Bill Belichick or Andy Reid in Sirianni, with one former Eagles executive saying Jeffrey thinks Nick is the real deal.
And I'm going to be honest with you, that smells like pure gasoline.
I'll admit it's hard to come to terms with that, especially after the collapse we saw last season, and seemingly no answers or obviously no way to stop the runaway train wreck. Yet on the flip side, there's no denying Sirianni has the highest win percentage of any Eagles coach through at least the first 50 games, while his 35-20 record is actually better than Andy Reid's was of 32-24 to start his head coaching career. Granted, I'm definitely not saying Sirianni's up there at that level, but assuming the head coach can take a step back and allow his coordinators the freedom to do their job, then at least the argument is you'd be maximizing his potential. Again, I could be totally wrong on this, and I will gladly admit it if I am, but I just don't see Sirianni being up to the level of an Andy Reid or a Bill Belichick, especially when it comes to X's and O's, to which most of us already know and saw for quite some time, since after all, Sirianni and many others admitted it was 100% his offense last season. And honestly, the more important part of Sirianni's growth is his relationship with Jalen Hurts, with The Athletic's Diana Rossini describing the relationship as a work in progress, citing some obvious disconnects, different personalities, and just not seeing eye to eye. And yeah, I get it. We've talked about this thing a ton at this point, but I'll say it again that Sirianni and Hurts don't have to be best friends. They just have to get along and seemingly make this thing work. Granted, the most important part of this is really Kellen Moore's relationship with Jalen Hurts and how they can blend the offense. And also, I'll repeat myself as well from past episodes and past videos that I'm not concerned about that at all, which FYI has been positive so far, with Jalen taking ownership of the offense and having good communication with the new OC. However, despite that positive, NFL analyst Doug Farrar wanted to remind everyone that Jalen Hurts isn't a consistent, full-field reader yet, saying he'll need to improve in that area to take his game to the next level in Kellen Moore's offense. Now, Doug also added that the pre-snap motion from Moore should prove to make the Birds' offense much more explosive, and that the new OC has typically had good plans to beat blitzes, so it can make Jalen's life easier there as well. Yet the biggest area that seems to make Hurts' life easier is getting him on the move, with Farrar sharing QB1 ranked near the very top when throwing on the move last season, racking up 7 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, and constantly picking up first downs and leaving defenses in a bind. That's part of what I've been saying too, that Jalen needs to run a little bit more, or I guess I should say at least pose a threat to run a little bit more, because after all, he's a 2-dimensional player. You don't really want to make him a 1-dimensional one. Heck, you paid him $255 million to be Jalen Hurts and all that comes with that, not $255 million and then turn him into something else. Let me just make sure and clarify that I'm all for protecting Jalen Hurts, and no, I don't want to run him unnecessarily. However, it's just more so the illusion of running and keep the defenses guessing. Because let's be honest, at the same time, the late season injuries have no doubt affected his play in past years. But thankfully, as we've talked about, the Eagles have an answer to help that wear and tear in Saquon Barkley, who's taken to Philly almost immediately while clearly showing a much more optimistic and excited approach this season. I don't blame him. Who wouldn't want to play with this squad with all these weapons? Plus, it's totally understandable, but he had pretty much made up his mind after Joe Schoen made the phone call.
It was over after that phone call. in my opinion.
As soon as he said to go hit the market,
I never in my heart truly believed that they were going to match it, or they only wanted me for a lower price. So like, no matter what, I probably wasn't going to go back.
Like I said, I don't blame him. And ultimately, this season really just comes down to his health as to whether or not he's an All-Pro. Speaking of health, though, Jimmy Kempski broke the news that safety Sidney Brown will begin training camp on the physically unable to perform list, meaning he still counts to the 90-man roster spot, however, it doesn't rush him back unnecessarily. Although I'm with you that he's been posting some workouts looking very close to 100%, and even said recently if it was up to him, he'd already be back, but that he's letting trainers and doctors decide when he'll ultimately return. So while I've got to imagine he'll be good to go by week 1, it does throw into question the possibility about the Eagles needing some more depth at safety. Of course, unfortunately, veteran Eddie Jackson is no longer an option after signing with Baltimore last week, since, he could have provided some more mentorship and veteran presence as a backup, knowledgeable Fangio scheme. But even with a couple safeties signing deals, there's still other options out there. Granted, Justin Simmons is undoubtedly the best option when it comes to ability and productiveness, which take this how you will, but some accounts even started sharing that Philly's been in talks with All-Pro safety, yet no official word on how close they are to a deal. And yeah, I realize we've talked about that ad nauseum at this point. It's been nonstop, so I'm really not going to go further into Justin Simmons. But I guess real quick, one last thing about that. It's not that I don't believe that Howie Roseman isn't calling about the All-Pro, because after all, there's a lot of productiveness there. It's just I'm not really sure how close they are to a deal. Granted, yes, you can make the case that Howie Roseman never leaves any stone unturned. So it's not impossible, yet it just feels pretty unlikely given how positive they've been about CJ Gardner-Johnson and Reed Blankenship for the starting spots. Even still, definitely something to keep an eye on. And who knows, maybe we see a new running back.
3 individuals on our team that continually are in my ear about, and they'll even show me their steps. Look what I could do. Look at these steps. I was like,
amazing.
So my phrase to these guys is always, everybody wants to run the rock, but what if I need you to block? They don't want no part of that. So those 3 guys are Jordan Mailata. Jalen Carter feels that he would be a really good fullback in short yardage. And Jordan Davis is another one of those guys that have shown me their footwork at the running back position on multiple occasions. So there's some competition in that backfield for the big guy, the extra guy. And, just, again, you want to talk about a little bit of exclusive. So a couple of years ago,
that's amazing.
That is now retired, Fletcher Cox, has actually taken reps in our backfield going downhill. We never got to it, never done it. So you just never know.
All right, realistically, I'm kind of doubting that one, but you can't tell me seeing Mailata, Jalen Carter, or Jordan Davis carrying the football wouldn't be fun to watch. Plus, it's not like Mailata especially doesn't have experience doing something similar. Or heck, if you go back to the Breadman's college days, remember he was one heck of a fullback. So I don't know, maybe the more that I think about it, I shouldn't really count it out. Anyway, there's lots to keep track of because the competition's going to be fierce. However, Pro Football Network's Anthony DeBona believes the Eagles will sign a safety soon. So of course, we had to hop on to discuss that and preview all the positional matchups you need to keep an eye on. Training camp, we've waited all this time, but it is finally basically here. With the terms of how quickly it is, the players report Tuesday, so depending on when people are watching this, it could be, the day of or one more day away. Wednesday, the actual practice, going to be 9:30 a.m. press conference with Nick Sirianni, and then 10 o'clock practice starts. It's crazy because we had tons of these discussions, right? All the hypotheticals, who's going to be there, who's not going to be there. We officially have word of a player who will at least not start out within training camp. That's Sidney Brown on the physically unable to perform list. You talked about him last week and had an article about him that you wrote up there too, about just the uncertainties of the safety position. We have had many conversations of who that might be, should the Eagles add a player, all this other stuff. But just speak a little bit more on kind of the fragility of this situation and Sidney Brown, being on the PUP list, being there.
It's a little bit surprising because I feel like I shared the workout videos that he had posted on Instagram, and it seemed like he was making good progress, that maybe he was going to make a full recovery in time for the start of training camp. But obviously they're going to play it slow. They know he played well for the second half of the season last year, so they're not going to rush him back. But like I talked about, even if he was fully healthy, I feel like they still have a lot of injury concerns there with CJ Gardner-Johnson, and Reed Blankenship missed a couple of games, and now Sidney Jones obviously coming back. So it's just, we'll see what happens, because it's just, I said Sidney Jones, I mean Sidney Brown. But it's just a fragile situation, because overall the depth isn't great behind those 3. And like I said, the reliability of those 3, we don't know how good it's going to be going forward. So there's still a couple options out there. Obviously, a couple names have been poached off the market in the last week or so. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. But as far as the PUP goes, it just means that he can't practice right now. Yeah, Jimmy Kempski reported it, so give him credit. But it just seems like they might bring him back before the season starts. But if he doesn't come back, then he has to miss at least 4 games. But for now, he does still count towards the 90-man roster, even though he's on the PUP list. So I saw a couple of people saying that, oh, they should just sign somebody now, but he's not necessarily freeing up a spot. So he's still taking up a spot while he's on that list. It just means he can't practice, and we'll see what happens before the season starts. But it kind of puts him on a clock there.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you mentioned too. Like you say, because the initial inclination is, all right, hey, cool, let's go ahead and get someone immediately. And, but with him taking up a spot, it doesn't exactly add up that way. However, as we've talked about on a number of different shows here and bringing up different names, the idea of bringing another safety, regardless of what happened to Sidney Brown, was, hey, you may want to look at getting a fourth safety because of the C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Reed Blankenship, the durability, question marks there. All credit to Mekhi Garner. Maybe he wins out on a spot. I know Andre Sam is another name that we've mentioned in previous episodes. But having said that, it felt like with the situation of Eddie Jackson signing to Baltimore very recently, that was a name that we continued to throw out there. What does that leave open? You had a kind of a great mention or great tweet about that as far as several different options that the Eagles could consider. But talk to the fans that maybe haven't seen that, considerations for other players out there, other safety availability for the Eagles on that side.
So it feels like safety's been like one of the slower markets in free agency just in general. But it's also interesting because a bunch of them have existing relationships or history working with coaches on the Eagles defensive staff. So obviously Justin Simmons is what everybody's looking at. They think he's a great target. It's an obvious fit because of his time with Christian Parker and Vic Fangio, but who knows what's going to happen there. But then even beyond him, Quandre Diggs was in Seattle with Clint Hurt and Roy Anderson. Ryan Neal was also in Seattle with Clint Hurt. Adrian Amos was with Vic Fangio and Roy Anderson in Chicago. And then Kareem Jackson, although might get banned from the NFL if he has one more dirty hit, but he also had time with Vic Fangio and Christian Parker in Denver too. So, there's a lot of options out there. It's just a matter of who they're going to take. And if they feel like they need to, maybe they really like these young guys and they're confident that Sidney Brown's going to make a full recovery before the start of the regular season. And they feel fine rolling forward with that. But if they do want to make a move here, there are a couple intriguing names out there.
Those are several names, like you say, the connection that they have, and that's usually where I think most people naturally, understand is like, all right, hey, who has the connections there? Are there any types of, networking going on or just familiarity with the system? Certainly in the sense of like a later type of signing. As you pointed out, and as we've said a number of different times, Justin Simmons, yes, makes a lot of sense from the framework of the Vic Fangio. Christian Parker knows the system, the scheme, is an all-pro. But naturally, he can kind of dictate his number here. And so he is playing the waiting game to say, hey, maybe a team, might have an injury, or a team's like, hey, we need to solidify this more so after training camp begins, or seeing the lack of players that they actually have there. So, it's a possibility. I would just caution and just, kind of throw this out there. Just be aware for everybody seeing, Justin Simmons linked to the Eagles, or Justin Simmons and the Eagles having conversations. I think as we've talked about and know for a number of times, it's not that like Howie Roseman is saying no to Justin Simmons. Like, he's going to do his homework. He's going to kind of just check in every once in a while of saying like, oh, let's see maybe what the number is. But I've seen a few reports out there from various accounts, will not name names, but saying that, I guess maybe alluding to the fact or giving credence to, oh, maybe it's going to happen sooner rather than later. Personally, my opinion, I'm not sure that's going to happen as quickly, but just for what that's worth, there's a couple that are throwing it out there as quickly or kind of as a more frequent thing there. Justin Simmons, like you said, is a name, but out of all the names you listed there, including Justin Simmons, do you feel like there's one more likely than the other? And, I guess percentage-wise, because we always have to, of course, percentage-wise for Justin Simmons, even if he's not your favorite target for the Eagles to sign him.
Well, one, I feel like every team should probably be calling in and checking with Justin Simmons because he's probably better than most safeties in the league right now. So
probably
any team that needs a safety is probably calling in and checking, saying, hey, what's your price? What are you looking for? How many years and whatever. So, I feel like he's still the number one option. I feel like it's obvious, although people have talked about maybe he didn't have the greatest relationship with Vic Fangio, and that kind of plays into it. But beyond him, I kind of power rank those 5 names that I put in terms of just fits for the Eagles. So I would put Simmons number 1, Adrian Amos number 2, because I just feel like he played the best out of those other 4 last season. I know he played between 2 teams, but his coverage numbers were pretty impressive, and I feel like he still has that tie to Vic Fangio. So I would put him number 2, then Kareem Jackson number 3, Ryan Neal number 5, and then Quandre Diggs number 4. I kind of went out of order there, but Ryan Neal, he's the youngest of those 5, but his coverage numbers were really bad last season. According to Pro Football Focus, he gave up a 158.3 passer rating. So if you don't know, that's actually a perfect passer rating.
Yeah,
so
I was gonna say.
That's not exactly the best look for him, but I mean, if they get real desperate and they feel like later in training camp, once these other guys have kind of found new homes, then maybe they'll bring him in. But if it's between him and who they already have, the younger guys, I'd probably lean more towards going with the guys that they have. But Adrian Amos would be probably my number one choice besides Justin Simmons.
Okay. All right. I like that. And also just, again, because it is it feels like we almost should have a sponsorship for you at this point of percentages and numbers because it is kind of the current segment, but
I'll leave that up to you. I'm sure you could find somebody.
we can try to work on that. Do you have a percentage for Justin Simmons to the Eagles as of pre-training camp here?
Let's go 33.3%. But I feel like as far as like just adding a safety, I feel like with your secondary, especially, communication is so important. So you don't really want to be adding a guy like late or even during the season, because we saw with Kevin Byard last year, the communication was kind of a mess in the secondary. Granted, that wasn't really his fault. They changed defensive coordinators and that kind of made things even worse. But I feel like the earlier the better, getting these things sorted out and who's going to start, who's not. I feel like we're working on that communication on basically any level of either side of the ball. It's just so important to have that settled early, and you don't really want these competitions dragging in late into training camp, into preseason, and then the regular season. You kind of want to have that all squared away early. So best case scenario, I think they sign somebody maybe either this week or the first week of training camp to kind of get things going.
Okay, I like it. Something to keep an eye on, obviously, very quickly as you're predicting a signing coming fairly soon within that side. Now, of course, obviously going back to the Ryan Neal comment, not that that's impossible, but I guess if you want the positive optimism there, he can't do any worse. He could improve on his secondary. However, what we all saw from last season, I don't know that very many people are just lining up to sign, that is your first available option. So I agree with your stack ranking in terms of who you might want to consider and names to go after. So we'll see what they do there, but maybe a name on that side.
But one thing with Ryan Neal, it's weird because I feel like whenever I watch the Bucs, I feel like he was playing well. Maybe I just didn't watch them good enough and his coverage was really that bad, but I feel like he was playing pretty good given the situation that he was put in, but who knows?
I don't know. I will also say, too, I think we're all, you and I are in agreement, lots of people watching are in agreement. Sometimes PFF rankings and grades, take them with a grain of salt. Sometimes, because, the eyes tell you one thing and the stats or analysis tell you a little bit of a different story. But
that's why I usually lean more towards like their actual like counting stats and not necessarily the grades, because
fair.
I feel like the grades over the years, I just still can't figure them out. So I kind of just lean towards, hey, he allowed this many receptions on this many targets and this many coverage snaps. I feel like that kind of is like black and white, whereas with the grades, it's just like you don't know what goes into it and how they really add them up. So I kind of avoid that.
There's maybe not complete objectivity, but still, take it for what you will. Needless to say, there's going to be lots of competition. Whether you sign someone, like you mentioned, very early on, or it takes a little bit, competition is going to be all over the place, not just with the safety spot, as we all know. There's lots of positions, lots of camp battles going on for the Eagles. I am super excited about a ton of different positions, and I've mentioned those in the past. We both have talked about those a number of times. But going into this now, is there like a top positional battle that as things have shaken up or kind of transpiring into training camp that you have your eye on more than the others? And I'm sure we're going to touch on all of these here, but I'm just curious if there's one that's at the top of your list.
I wrote a couple down here, but I feel like the first one, and I feel like maybe if you asked me this like a month ago, I wouldn't have even brought it up. But now that Baldy spoke about it and we spoke about it last episode, I feel like right guard kind of has to be at the top of the list now, because we know how important the offensive line is, obviously, and we know Jeff Stoutland's great at what he does, but now it seems like Tyler Steen and Mekhi Becton might really be having a battle for that job, where a month or two ago it seemed like it was Tyler Steen's job to lose and he kind of had it locked in already. But now Baldy's saying that Mekhi Becton might really have a chance to win it. So, I mean, he's only a year older than Tyler Steen. I know that he's had a couple more years in the NFL, but he came in really young, so he's got that experience starting at tackle under his belt. And if he was willing to embrace the transition to guard, I feel like that's going to be an interesting one to watch. But then besides that, you got the second cornerback spot, linebacker number 2. I mean, it seems like Zach Bond has that on lock, but Nakobe Dean might push for it. And then wide receiver 3 is always interesting because you got Paris Campbell and then the young guys and John Ross and Britton Covey. So that's going to be a fun one to watch as well.
Yeah, so many, like you say, both sides of the ball. I'm just excited, honestly, that we have like actual legit football coming up, that we can really, take some actual meaningful news and reports and, not really video footage, unfortunately, because the Eagles aren't going to allow that. But we'll get tweets from it so we can try to analyze the tweets as best we can. But for those that are actually in attendance of training camp, they'll have more witness reports and things like that. But going back to the Steen and Becton, I mean, I'm right there with you because it did feel like we talked, for a couple, probably a couple months of saying, or at least a full month of saying all right, hey, Steen's probably the guy. You like or you're hoping for the transition or kind of the progression that he should have taken year 1 to year 2. Jeff Stoutland speaking highly of him and everything there, but then Mekhi Becton seemingly out of nowhere, it felt like, because there were some speculation of, maybe he's going to play guard, might have that ability. But it's not until Baldy kind of brought it up and even saying hey, he's the best run blocker on the team, that then gets you and you're going, wait a second, not just a good run blocker, the best run blocker on the team. That's really saying something. And so I'm excited if he actually can. It feels like I asked a question on a past episode of hey, who's your dark horse candidate for the Eagles in training camp? And the favorite, and not as surprising, very surprising if you'd asked, like you said, a month ago, but the surprise, not as surprising, was Mekhi Becton as the dark horse candidate, because it does feel like he's gained some traction, gaining some momentum. He has that potential. And like you say, there's not really much of an age difference, and he's a former first-round pick. So, the Eagles signed him for a reason, and obviously Jeff Stoutland's probably looking at it and going, there's a lot of potential in this guy. He hasn't lived up to the expectations there, but, hey, you give him Jeff Stoutland University graduation honors, and then, you say, all right, hey, let's see what this dude can do. So I'll be very interested to see that, because there's lots of predictions I've seen across Twitter and everywhere else, hey, Becton's going to win the right guard spot. But I don't know. We'll see.
I feel like that's what we talked about, because I kind of went back and watched that first episode we did after the Becton signing, and we were like, listen, he probably understands this might be his last chance as a starting job, or even a notable role as a swing tackle. But what better situation than Philadelphia with Jeff Stoutland, who's worked with guys with a similar body style like Jordan Mailata. So, I mean, if he's willing to embrace this guard spot and really make that transition, then it's huge. And I also wonder, were they really going to give him a look at guard until before Landon Dickerson was out of OTAs with that personal reason or whatever? So I almost wonder if Landon Dickerson being out kind of opened up a door that Becton wasn't really expecting to have a chance in, and then he kind of just took advantage of it and made an impression, and now it might be a legitimate battle. So it's going to be fun to watch. Obviously, contractually, the Eagles probably want to see Tyler Steen win the job because they have him under team control for 2 more years for next to nothing. Whereas if Becton emerges as this great guard, then all of a sudden they might have to pay him $15, $20 million. Who knows if he really does look that great? But I mean, that's kind of a question you say for next offseason. And worst comes to worst, if he does play great, and you can let him walk and get a compensatory pick if you don't sign anybody notable, and then you kind of slide Tyler Steen in then. But it's just interesting that we're going to actually have a battle there.
That's a good point you bring up, though, which also it's a good problem to have as well, if it does come to that point. But I don't know, maybe Steen needs to, say hey, Landon, what are you doing, man? Come on, you couldn't have been here at camp. If you were here, then
it's interesting to think about.
It is, because I had not thought about that until you just brought that up. But that's an interesting conspiracy theory thought on that side. I love it. I can appreciate it. You're gonna have
put my tinfoil hat on.
It's gonna be some people are gonna say, oh, you got to be kidding me here. But that is an interesting thought on that side, because I think the immediate inclination from just about everyone was well, I shouldn't say just about everyone, because there were a few, I know, but most people it felt like was hey, he's going to be a swing tackle, and maybe he'll be good backup, versatility, things like that. But yeah, all of a sudden, and hey, Landon's got an excused absence. And Becton's getting left guard rotation, getting some left guard snaps, and then who knows? Maybe Stoutland looks at it a little bit more. So whoa, wait a minute, I like what I see here at left guard. This could be something now. So I don't know. And then it just the story builds. So
it's like that meme of the guy walking with the girl walking that way, and then he's looking back at the other girl. So he was holding Tyler Steen's hand, but then he's looking back at Mekhi Becton wait a second, what's over there?
Yeah, let's take one more look at that there. That might be a possibility. So I like it. Okay, so something that I was not actually thinking about. However, we'll say we're not overreacting to anything here yet. Again, there's lots of time to come, and we got to make sure who's going to win out the camp battles. Lots of those that are going to be going on, as you mentioned. At the same time, it feels like you want to try to temper some of those expectations or temper some of those like early knee-jerk reactions, because it feels like just about every single year, and I know for sure last year I was in this boat of like, oh man, I got some highlights of, some players making some plays, and they're going to be at that position. And then, long story short, the plays unfold, or kind of camp unfolds, and it's like, well, maybe not. Christian Ellis is maybe not the linebacker that you think he's going to be. So there could be some of those, but why is it important? I guess sharing a little bit on that side, but what do you take away from the first, I should say maybe like the first week of camp, but also why is it important to temper those expectations, not get carried away with, hey, someone made one highlight play or one really great day of camp?
So I'm sure Jalen Hurts is probably going to throw like 3 interceptions and it's going to be the end of the world, but everybody needs to relax because things like that are going to happen, especially in the first week of training camp, first 2 weeks. I mean, these guys are probably the starters, still probably won't play much in the preseason. So everything that they do in training camp or these joint practices is going to be held against them. And everybody's going to make a big deal about it because it's probably going to be most of the snaps that they're going to see of these guys before the regular season. So maybe we'll see a little bit on preseason because it's new system. So they'll want to get them some real game action. But as far as what you see in practice, I don't think it's a big deal to count how many interceptions Jalen Hurts has, or if Kenny Pickett has a better completion percentage, or I feel like the main things you need to look at is who's lining up with the starters, who's lining up with the second team, things like that. I feel like what they actually do in those situations can be good or bad because I feel like the players are going to really prove themselves in the meeting rooms and things like that. As far as the play on the field, that's more of like an end of the roster kind of guys battling for roster spots and potentially practice spots. But so it's like things like that you have to look at for that regard. But I feel like the starters, they're going to be starters no matter what for the most part. Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, if they struggle, no matter what, their spots are cemented. So people make a big deal about it because of their names, but I really wouldn't make a big deal about it myself.
So you're telling me that, whenever we have a weekend, because it probably inevitably is going to happen, but we got reports of Kenny Pickett is outperforming Jalen Hurts. Just maybe, not carry away with that. It has already happened. So I'm trying to just gear up and get ready because it's probably going to happen again. Someone's going to be like, oh my gosh, Kenny Pickett didn't throw an interception today. Jalen Hurts did. Is it a new quarterback one in Philly?
Just get ready for it because it's going to be, Jalen Hurts couldn't score in the red zone drill, and then Kenny Pickett was hooking up with Johnny Wilson for 3 touchdowns, and it's going to be the end of the world. So just everybody relax. It's going to be okay, and then we'll see what happens in the regular season when it actually matters.
Right, yes, because that is when it matters. And they're learning a new offensive system, and, sometimes we have a quarterback that does better than others, but it matters more when it's like, hey, there's more to play for. Yes, you could say, all right, hey, training camp is important. You're getting a rhythm with the guys and everything else. But to your point, starters, they're solidified. Not a whole lot of craziness going on there. But on the flip side, if we talk about starters on the defense, there's not as much solidified there. I think most people understand that. We know that. There's several positional battles, as you mentioned a second ago. With cornerback in particular, I mean, that one feels like the most competitive in terms of just, we want to talk about the sheer volume of guys trying to battle for a roster spot, trying to battle for a starting spot. Slay, that's probably a given. I've seen a few minor comments of someone saying like, no, he's not going to. That's kind of crazy. Maybe we're wrong. Some crazier things have happened, I suppose. But that's kind of like, all right, Slay's going to start. The question is, who's going to start next to Slay? I mean, this is kind of just continued to build all throughout the offseason because we've talked about Isaiah Rodgers, the Keeler Ringo impressing. You've got some other names out there that are just more so, I guess, trying to make the roster spot. But kind of a 2-part question for you, I guess. I'm putting you on the spot. Who is going to start next to Slay? And then also, second part of that, how many corners are you keeping on the roster?
So I'll still go with a big fan of the show, Isaiah Rodgers. I think he kind of has the upper hand right now, only because I think playing outside cornerback, especially as a rookie, is really difficult. So I feel like if the Eagles and Vic Fangio feel comfortable with Rodgers and think they can kind of bring Mitchell along a little slower, maybe mixing him up in the slot, playing him on the outside here and there in certain situations, not just making him a full-blown start on the outside from week 1. I know fans might go crazy about it and might think, oh my God, he's a bust at that point. But I just think bringing him along and getting him acclimated to the NFL, that might be the best course of action. And overall at the cornerback position, I feel like 7's probably still the magic number, especially because a guy like Avonte Maddox can kind of play that slot corner and safety if they feel like they can view him there. So he can kind of play both roles. That's why I would go with 7 at corner. So I would say Darius Slay, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Keeler Ringo, those are all locks. I think Isaiah Rodgers is a lock at this point too. And then I would put Avonte Maddox and Tower Hall as my last 2 making it. But that means guys like Eli Ricks, Josh Jobe, they're not making the cut, even though they kind of impressed on special teams or in a little bit of duty here and there last season.
Mm-hmm.
But that just shows you how deep they are at corner, and they're going to have to make some tough decisions there.
It's a great problem that we've said for a really long time now, especially, at post draft, because it's like, man, you solidified it with 2 extra acquisitions there in Cooper DeJean and Quinell Mitchell. But it does feel like you're going to have guys who maybe you trade, maybe you're able to get something back for him. It's the James Bradberry question also, which I don't know necessarily do we still classify him as a cornerback? Is he a safety? Was he legit injured? Was he trying to?
I know. Like we joke about it at this point, but he's like the true wild card at this point because we don't know what's going to happen with him because like he was about to play safety and then he got hurt literally his first practice. So I mean, who knows? Maybe he plays safety. All of a sudden, he's like looks great at safety. But I personally think they'll move on from him. But you never know. And I feel like, maybe he's like a pup candidate and he'll start on that list to begin. And because Jimmy Kempski kind of alluded to, he might Sidney Brown might not be the only one that goes on that list. So maybe Bradberry can be, given that last time we saw him, he was injured. So maybe that's still lingering and they kind of have him on there until they figure out what they're going to do with him. But yeah, he's kind of making it tough in the secondary because if he is still on the roster, I feel like they kind of have to keep him around, but I don't think he's going to be on the roster. I feel like they're going to move on. So
that'd be interesting there. You got a, in air quotes, lingering injury for James Bradberry. That again, we don't know the full details. They could be legit, could be actual. It just seemed very strange that I'm watching a Sirianni press conference and then it ends and he's telling me he's going to play safety. And I'm like, all right, I'm kind of curious to see what the media reports about him. And it's like, oh, James Bradberry is not practicing this today. Okay, well, there you go.
He couldn't even get through warm-ups.
He couldn't get through warm-ups, I know. And some people get injured. That's fine. It does happen. But I'm with you. It is the ultimate wild card because, like, is there a whole lot crazier? I mean, there's maybe a few that you can imagine, but would there be a crazier storyline if all of a sudden we're coming out of camp and going, hey, James Bradberry is a safety on this team. And, oh, by the way, like he's, seemingly solid safety on this team. I personally can't envision that, Again, we've said a number of times, nothing personal against him, but like play corner, I don't really trust it as far as tackling ability. We haven't seen as many, we haven't seen actual reps of him being at safety and trying to make those tackles, but I'm just envisioning what he did in the corner spot. And it's kind of like, I hope that there's other options there. But I mean, so far, if you haven't signed anybody, maybe it seems crazy, seems strange, but maybe that is an option for the Eagles going into it. Go, hey, we need a fourth safety. That's our fourth safety. That's going to be our guy.
On the bright side, we should get an answer here soon. So we'll find out because I feel like we've been talking about James Bradberry's situation for like 6 months now.
That's fair.
It hasn't been resolved. So
it has been a long time. Yes.
We should know by August the latest. So that should be resolved soon.
There's still lots of doubters, understandably, but there's also lots of doubters for Nakobe Dean. Like it feels like we haven't really mentioned his name a whole lot. We've talked about the linebackers, but we've talked more so about Devin White and Zach Bond, understandably so, because they're making more of the plays and being in those actual spots there with the first team mostly. So. Devin White, we've talked about this, in several different recordings, but it's like Devin White is the guy that feels very solidified in his spot there. I mean, green dot wearer, presumably, most likely not going to get moved off. I think he'd have to have a just terrible, miserable training camp to maybe change that outset or that outlook for him. But Zach Bond, he's right there kind of in that position of, okay, looked promising in OTAs. Can he keep up that momentum? How did he play in preseason if he does? And is he able to keep that spot? Or does Nakobe Dean kind of have that resurgence? Because he mentioned it in a press conference, I think right before, if I'm not mistaken, right before OTA started, or maybe right as OTA started, about like wanting to prove the doubters wrong. Could it be a good thing of him in a way, I guess, flying more under the radar? Because his name has not been mentioned. It felt like before Zach Bond got there that we would be talking a lot about, hey, Nakobe's doing this or he's not doing that. And more so, it's just like, well, you're really not hearing his name much at all. So could that be a good thing in your mind? You see him maybe elevating his game or having a chip on his shoulder, an extra chip on his shoulder, I guess?
Well, I don't think he's going to get above Devin White or Zach Bond. I feel like those guys seem like towards the end of OTAs, it's really like trended towards them being the top two, like cemented at linebacker, and then Nakobe Dean was kind of a bit of a drop off. But maybe it is a good thing for him because I feel like he kind of had like unfair hype coming into the NFL because he played for Georgia and because he was projected as a first round pick and then fell to the third. Because if you look at most third round picks, they don't really have these high expectations that Philadelphia's fans have kind of had for Nakobe Dean. And because he plays linebacker and because they never invest in the position, people were like, oh my God, he's the savior. He's going to be phenomenal. But he really hasn't looked that great whenever he has played. He's shown flashes here and there, but he is smaller, so that's something that he can never really overcome. It's just going to matter of if he could stay on the field and if he can prove that he could stay on the field consistently and then make plays whenever he's on the field. He can't really be undersized and then be missing tackles or missing games here and there. That's just not going to work well for him. So I feel like maybe now that he's kind of out of the spotlight, it'll help him a little bit better, but I'm not sure that he's going to beat either one of those two guys that we talked about out for the starting job.
I tend to agree with you. I've said also kind of likewise. It's like it does feel like certainly Devin White, Zach Bond to me, very high on his game. If he can, just keep up that momentum and be able to play, just make some more plays. If he does get, I would assume he'll probably, because it's not in the same retrospect of going like, oh, hey, there's a bona fide starter, very likely Pro Bowl or whatever in terms of where he's playing. It's like you'll see some snaps in the preseason, but it's just you don't want to see a Christian Ellis of sorts. You don't want to see a guy who's got there's some hype, and then all of a sudden he doesn't do anything with it. So I don't think it'll be there. I'm leaning towards more, and maybe this is too optimistic, but I'm leaning and hoping more towards Andrew Van Ginkel showing than a Christian Ellis showing for Zach Bond. We'll see if it goes to that extreme, because I know that's pretty high up there, but it is with Fangio, and he likes the similarities between those. So you never know. On the other side of the ball, though, going back to offense, the other positional battle, or at least question mark that we should bring up is, wide receiver 3, or maybe just wide receiver as a whole, because it does seem like wide receiver 3, very much for Paris Campbell. Not a guarantee, I suppose. You could argue that maybe someone could slide in there and try to compete with that. But early on, it's most likely going to be all Paris Campbell and his job to lose. But the wide receiver spot as a whole is very interesting, because we look outside of those 3, and we've talked about this a couple of times as well, but it's like, how many wide receivers do you keep? Because, however you do there, it all trickles down throughout the entire roster. And as I continue to look at it, it's like you can't really seemingly, cut the rookies. But then does Britton Covey make a roster spot? Is he worth being able to stay on the roster? John Ross was turning some heads back at OTAs. Is he able to solidify himself? He's working out with Jalen Hurts recently, I believe I think in Florida, was it? Or I think recently somewhere in there. But, being able to get some extra reps with the squad. So there's lots of guys that trying to make a name for themselves, trying to make that roster spot. But it does feel like maybe Britton Covey's on the outside looking in. Where are you at with Britton Covey? Where are you at with the wide receivers, I guess, as a whole?
I've kind of been, last year at this time, I felt like I was the one hyping up Britton Covey because of his return ability. And I felt like he was a better receiver than people were giving him credit for. Whereas now I've kind of flipped completely on him, because I know even though he was one of the best punt returners in the NFL, I just feel like he hasn't really shown anything as a receiver. So, and for them, I feel like they really need somebody there that, if A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith get hurt, they need somebody that they can kind of trust to not just be a punt returner. They have to contribute as a receiver as well. So I feel like right now you kind of have 5 guys locked in. You talk about A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Paris Campbell, and then the 2 rookies, Anaya Smith and Johnny Wilson. Besides them, I would probably give John Ross the edge over Britton Covey, because I know he hasn't shown much as a receiver either, but he's a bit bigger. He has experience on the outside, and I feel like he has that speed that they can rely on if they needed it, whereas Britton Covey, I don't even know if they really have a role for him in the offense outside of special teams, where he would just be a punt returner. So I feel like now with the kick return game changing, they're going to probably lean more towards keeping guys for that game over the punt return, just holding a spot for a punt returner, because now you might need to carry more linebackers to defend those kick returns, and you can't go as heavy at wide receiver or things like that. So I just feel like I wrote about it on PFN as well, as far as players that need to have a good showing at training camp, and Britton Covey was on that list because he just can't be a good punt returner. I don't know if teams can really keep guys around like that just don't contribute outside of that role. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with him, because he really hasn't shown much so far.
It's totally fair. Yeah, I could definitely understand that, but I could certainly get behind it as well, because you're talking about, you need some versatility, especially with for the most part, I mean, you got a lot of depth in this roster in a lot of other areas. And again, even if it's not within receiver spot, if you add an extra position to keep, then all of a sudden you're taking away, could be a linebacker spot, could be another corner spot that you need to keep. Who knows where that is, but there's only going to be so many, and that's where I kind of go back and forth on the same side. You did mention, by the way, Anthony DeBona, Pro Football Network, NFL analyst. If you guys are not following, make sure to do that. Got a link in the description, but I've also got a link in the description to the article that you just referenced, because there's 7 players that you kind of talk about as far as they do need to make a name for themselves or do need to have a strong camp for a number of reasons. Talk a little bit about a couple of those other players. I think specifically Kenny G, we're talking about offense, but Kenny G and Albert O, those are 2 names there of guys that you make the case for need to have a strong camp. Reasons for both of them and why?
Well, they're both in contract years, so that already kind of puts pressure on them, because Kenny G's heading into the last year of his rookie contract, and now they added Will Shipley relatively high in the draft, and then they added Tyrion Davis-Price earlier in the offseason. And then they signed undrafted free agents. So there's more competition there. I feel like he's still going to make the team. I don't think like his roster spot's in question, but I feel like he could lose that running back number 2 spot to Will Shipley with a good showing from Shipley, because it seemed like Shipley was already turning heads during OTAs. He was working out with Jalen Hurts afterwards. So I feel like he's kind of trending in that direction where he can kind of take that RB2 role, and they know they have him for the next 4 years alongside Saquon for 3 years, where they can kind of lean on that duo and kind of phase out Gainwell, because he didn't really impress that much last season, and it felt like he kind of fell off as the season progressed. So I feel like they kind of gave him a chance to play a couple high carry games. He had like 15 carries or so in week 1 and week 2 last season, but he only averaged like 3.4 yards per carry in those 2 showings. So he kind of proved that he can't be relied upon in terms of if they need a bell cow, if Saquon goes down, where Will Shipley kind of handled big workloads in college. So maybe they'll give him a chance at that RB2 spot. And then with Albert O, I just feel like Grant Calcaterra's kind of looked good. He was turning heads at OTAs. And then CJ Uzomah's a guy, a veteran that I'm higher on than a lot of people, because I feel like he's shown flashes in the past. Granted, he's older, but Albert O couldn't even suit up for the Eagles last season, even though he was there for weeks and weeks. And then when he was on the field, he didn't catch the only pass that he was targeted. So I just feel like he hasn't shown anything. I know they brought him back on a 1-year deal, but I don't think that means he has a roster spot cemented by any means at all.
Yeah, Albert O was one of those, to me, very similar, at least personal feelings of like a Rashad Penny. There was a lot of hype, and then it was like, man, this dude just can't get on the field and play at all. And then even, in the limited sample size, to your point, just didn't do a whole lot. So it will be interesting, but that is one of those that, I was not really even sure if he would be brought back or if you would, sign him on that. But the fact that it's like, hey, you're going to see if he's got a shot. There is a lot of competition from that side. It's not as vitally important, but still we do talk about the tight end 2 position. And if Jalen Hurts will maybe have more comfortability throwing there, hopefully Dallas Goedert can stay healthy. But at times when you have the tight end 2 on the field, it changes things in the dynamics. So I don't know. It would be cool if you can get it out of him, because we've talked about it. Everyone I think knows and understands it by watching the game. There's a lot of athletic ability, but it's like it just hasn't translated, whether it be, a liability in the run game because he can't block, or he's just telegraphing because it's like, well, if he's on the field, they're for sure going to pass. They're not going to run with him there. Or it's just lack of, picking up the scheme. I don't know what it is for sure, but just not being able to get him there. So it will be interesting on that side. Sticking with the offense, and I have to bring this up briefly. It's not the topic that I really love discussing, and I think we've talked about it way too many times, and people are tired of it. But I just thought it was more so humorous. I loved your point as well, because just to give a little backstory. So Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni may not have the best relationship. Stop us if you've heard that before, because it's been forever. But Diana Rossini, who does good reporting, does good work for The Athletic, it just felt strange timing of all of a sudden she's going to try to, say this like, well, it's a work in progress. They have a work in progress relationship. Don't really necessarily get along that well. All of the offense and all the things you saw from the Eagles last year was Nick Sirianni. I loved your response from a day away and then getting in to hear those reports, and you tweeted about that going like, if this is, like to Eagles fans, this is not news. We've heard about this for forever now. Just any other takeaways, though, to that from hearing it? I know you got that in the tweet, but I'm just real quick curious on the thoughts there, because it has been kind of the continual thing. But to get a national reporter going, hey, here's this thing that's going on now with the Eagles, thoughts there?
So I was spending the day at Sesame Place for my kids because it's their like birthday weekend. So then I get home and I'm finally checking my phone, seeing the alerts, and I'm like, Diana Rossini is great. She's one of the best reporters around. So I'm not going to bash her at all. This is nothing against her.
Sure.
but it just seemed like it was kind of, if you followed the Eagles closely at all over the last season, everybody could see that because, I mean, you could see that the offense, Nick Sirianni said it himself. He said, like, this is my offense, and people thought he was kind of just falling on the sword, but he was serious. Like, that was his offense. Anybody knew that watched Brian Johnson be an OC at Florida and the plays he called and how even the systems that he played in when he was a player, that's not the offense that he would run. I mean, so it was drastically different, and I feel like that's why people thought Brian Johnson deserved another chance somewhere else, which he eventually did get. So, but I mean, it's just all of that was so obvious because obviously Jalen Hurts is going to be pissed off that basically his best friend was fired and pretty much made the fall guy because of Nick Sirianni's kind of arrogance in a way because he didn't want to change his way, and now that he was kind of held to the fire and they kind of made him make changes. Mm-hmm. Now he's kind of giving up the job to Kellen Moore, and we're going to see more changes. So, I mean, nothing in that story was new to me. I felt like it was all just what we already know if you followed that, but now it was just attached to according to a source. And so now it just felt like things were getting a little too quiet in Philadelphia around the Eagles, and now kind of brought this stuff back to light. But I really don't think it's a big deal. And I feel like it was all stuff that we already knew if anybody followed them relatively closely over the last year.
For sure, yeah. But like you say, if things are dying down, then you got to have some other topics. So there was a source or someone that's actually saying, well, hang on, here's what's actually going on. But I'm with you on that. Also, apparently, I believe the Inquirer was the one who first reported this, but Jeffrey Lurie thinks and says that Nick Sirianni is the real deal. So if there was any like Lurie questioning or not sure about Sirianni, he apparently believes that. Now, the former executive, based on the quote from the Inquirer, was speculating or there was some, a little bit of inferring that perhaps they didn't also agree. Now, is that the reason they're a former executive? Who knows? We could speculate on who that is. We're not going to. But just for those that are wondering, Jeffrey Lurie is confident in Nick Sirianni. We've talked a number of times. This is a very important season for him. The Eagles have to be they've got to win. I think we agreed they have to win a playoff game, right? Was that what we agreed? It's got to be at least a playoff game win for Sirianni if he keeps his job.
Yeah. I feel like he has to have like double-digit regular season wins and then win at least one playoff game because if you can't back into the postseason and then lose again, that's just gonna go out bad. And there's gonna be too many good options that are gonna be available at head coach. Maybe even Kellen Moore if the offense does look good and they kind of just want to elevate him instead of losing him. Yeah, that Nick Sirianni they can't underperform again because now they're an even more talented team on both sides of the ball, so they just can't look that bad again. It's gonna look really bad on Sirianni, but at the same point. Of course, Jeffrey Lurie is going to be confident in Nick Sirianni because his winning percentage is absurd. I think Matt LaFleur is the only coach that had like a better winning percentage through 50-plus games in there to start their career. That's an active head coach right now. So I feel like that's notable. You're not just going to – granted, I was also saying that maybe they should move on. I'm not going to hide that. But the fact that he was able to give up control of the offense is what I feel like played a huge role because obviously that system grew stale, and that's why he's still around. But this team definitely seems like his last chance because I know the report also came out that Howie Roseman was the one driving the decisions for the coordinators, but Nick Sirianni understood that things weren't working and he was willing to make that change. So now it's just a matter of seeing if it works. If it doesn't work, then they might clean house and move on from everybody. So we'll see.
Yeah. And I was saying the same thing. Everybody I think knows that, or most people know that, but I was saying the same thing with Sirianni. It's like, it's maybe just move on, even though with the winning record, like you say, and everything there, it's just the team, the vibes, all of how it just crashed and burned at the end. But again, we're moving on because this is training camp for next season or for this season is right around the corner, and we are basically there. And again, Jeffrey Lurie feels like a good segue saying that the real deal is Nick Sirianni. Gabe Hall is the real deal. We both are really high on him. I am absolutely. It's no wonder he was drafted in the first round of the UFL draft. Wade Phillips liked what he saw. San Antonio Brahmas, if people are not aware of where Wade Phillips is or what he's doing for the head coach for the San Antonio Brahmas.
Defending champions, I think, right?
Well, they lost to Birmingham Stallions.
Oh, did they lose?
They unfortunately did, but they won their conference. So,
I know you're a big San Antonio fan. Sorry to bring that back up.
It's at least in Texas, but I'm not really. I wouldn't say I'm a big fan of that. I might be now. If Gabe Hall does decide to go or he ends up there, sure, yeah. But he won't be because, again, Gabe Hall is the real deal. You're not going to let him walk. It is. I liked it, honestly, because I talked about this on the past show. I liked the fact that he got drafted. First off, first round pick, good for him. Congrats, because he didn't get drafted by the NFL draft. But also the fact that Wade Phillips, though, is the guy who's the one who did that, right? Because it's like, hey, he sees talent. He understands talent. He, very long history, long resume in the NFL and everything there. So I'm like, all right, he can see the potential with this dude. I just want to tell him like, hey, I'm sorry, by the way, that's not going to work out. He won't ever play. He won't ever play a single snap for you. Am I wrong? I mean, you're high on him as well, but like just thoughts on Gabe Hall.
I told you that I thought he was the best undrafted free agent that they signed, and I feel like
yes, you did.
Given the lack of depth and upside that they have along the defensive tackle spot, especially given a couple guys, Milton Williams heading into the last year of his deal, unless he signs an extension at some point. So they kind of need some long-term developmental project alongside Moro or Jomo. I just don't know if like Tui Poilotu or PJ Mustafa really offer the upside that a guy like Gabe Hall does. And then obviously he landed number 96, which is a great jersey number for an undrafted guy to land. Yep. It's not like he's playing defense.
A little bit of tongue in cheek with Wade Phillips, but like it is important that he got drafted because like, hey, they see the potential. But personally, the most excitement I got was reading your article of 7 players that need to have a strong camp. And not only is Gabe Hall not in there, but he's not even in the honorable mentions. Now I know that he's UDFA, so maybe that's the reason still. But like if I'm taking that to go like, all right, hey, Marlon Tuipulotu needs to have a strong camp, but Gabe Hall does not because he's got he still needs to have a good camp. But for what that's worth, I like the hype. I like the potential. I could see him making the roster, and I'm sticking to that still. So there were people that are going like, whoa, what happened? Like he got drafted by the UFL, but doesn't really mean anything if Philly keeps on the roster.
AJ Brown got drafted by the Padres, I think, right? In the MLB draft, and that's also
true.
Didn't happen. So that doesn't really that doesn't always mean anything. So I think like 2 other Eagles undrafted players or something got drafted. So don't worry. The Eagles have first dibs, and then if they get cut, don't land on a practice squad, then they might be in the UFL. So don't panic just yet.
Right. And then they can make a name for themselves. Then who knows? Sometimes players come back and forth. We've seen that in the past as well. But yes, I'm excited for his potential. I don't know if this is where you would go with this, but just to kind of recap this thing, because we are excited to see training camp. We're going to have more breakdowns and recaps, and I'm excited for the next recording because we'll actually be able to say, hey, so-and-so did this at training camp, and tell me about that instead of these hypotheticals. But before I let you go, I've got to talk about, or at least ask you the question of, is there one unexpected player, one surprising player that you think makes the roster to predict right now before the training camp begins? I don't know if it is Gabe Hall. That's perfectly fine if you want to say that. I feel like it's not as surprising, but I would allow it because it's Gabe Hall. But is there someone else? Who's your surprising making the roster candidate?
I actually wrote 2 down, so I got 1 on each side of the ball.
Okay.
So one I already mentioned, so it's not really a surprise, but John Ross, I feel like he's not on everybody's list, but I would give him the edge over Britton Covey if they do go with 6 guys at receiver. Mm-hmm. And then the other one, I feel like I've been seeing him as a cut on a lot of people's predictions, but I think, especially given the new kickoff rules, maybe it's just in my head and because Bill Belichick mentioned people maybe going more linebacker heavy, but I think Oren Burks is going to make the team as a backup linebacker. I feel like a lot of times people have the Eagles only keeping like 4 linebackers or only 5, but I think they might go 6. They might go a little heavier at linebacker and keep him around because I feel like he did show flashes when he had to step in last season for the Niners, and he played all right in Green Bay as well. So I think he's maybe got some guy that people are sleeping on a bit, and I feel like he will make the roster when it's all said and done. All
right. Very interesting. I like that. I would I have the same for offense. So I've got John Ross on the offensive side. Defense, I mean,
Gabe Hall.
Again, it's not surprising for people. So I would say yes, because I just got to go ahead and put Gabe Hall up there. But if I've got to go with another one, to me, I go, and I don't even know, this might not be as surprising. It's gone back and forth, but I would say cornerback wise, I'm along the same mindset of saying Tyler Hall. So that may not be as unexpected, but I've seen some people say, oh, Tyler Hall's not going to make it, or Eli Ricks is going to get in over him, even heck, Josh Jobe because of the special teams ability like we talked about. But I think there's a lot of Andrew DeCecco mentioned back during, I think, the second day of minicamp, I believe, or maybe it was the third after the final day, but one of those days, like, hey, people are kind of sleeping on Tyler Hall. So I'd probably mention his name out there as well. Again, maybe not a super surprising one, but I would be, personally, I would be surprised, honestly, if he doesn't make it, because knowing Avonte Maddox, we wish him all the health in the world. We hope that he does not miss a single game, but just that possibility and the lack of depth that last year had at the slot position, and Howie Roseman saying we want to address that, it just feels like it'd be a little crazy if he were not to make the roster. But yeah, I would go with John Ross and then give me 2 guys on defense. I'll Gabe Hall, of course, and Tyler Hall. So we'll just throw the Hall brothers in. They're not brothers, by the way, because someone's going to ask him, be like, wait a second.
I honestly view Tyler Hall as like a lock at this point. I just feel like he has so much more experience in the slot than these other guys. Because even if you're going to throw like Quinyon Mitchell or Cooper DeJean in there, they really haven't played it even in college. So I feel like Tyler Hall's played it in the NFL. He's played it at a high level. So I feel like behind Avonte Maddox, if that's who you're viewing as the starter, you know his most reliable ability. It might be his unavailability. So you have to have somebody behind him. Unfortunately, it sucks to say that, but it's just the truth because they need somebody behind because it's only a matter of time before he misses some games.
Unfortunately, you're right. I mean, we hate to say that, but it's just the way that it's been the last several seasons. So, but again, maybe not. Maybe this is the year. Staying healthy. But we will see. But this is a blast, as always. Appreciate you hopping on. Again, like I said, thankfully, we're going to be talking about actual, legit happenings, what's going on at training camp. For all the people watching, make sure to hit the like button, comment. Let us know your thoughts. Who's your surprising roster guy to make the roster? Who's your surprising cut? Any critiques on mine or Anthony's analysis? We'll look at it. We'll take a look. We can agree to disagree if you don't agree with us there. But again, this is a blast. Make sure to follow Anthony DeBono, Pro Football Network analyst. Got a link in the description for all the content and articles as well. But appreciate you hopping on.
Thanks, man. It's a blast, and I'm excited to talk about people overreacting to Jalen Hurts next week. So it'll be fun.
Probably, that's the one part I'm not looking forward to. You want to end it this way too. So there you go. All right, but training camp is basically here. Appreciate you guys as always. Go Birds.